she knew that you were looking for her, and she knew
She knew she was going to be hunted like the dog she was. And yes, she knew, like a scared rabbit in an open field.
On September 9, 1999, a gentle bank teller named Girly Hossencofftt failed to arrive for work in Albuquerque. Inside her apartment, investigators found blood-soaked carpet and evidence of a violent struggle, but no body. What they uncovered instead was a conspiracy born from delusion, where alien DNA fantasies and pseudoscience masked deadly obsession. Two people who believed themselves chosen for an otherworldly mission had decided that one innocent woman stood in their way. How does shared madness become murder? Before we get into the story, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. Early evening settles over Albuquerque in 1998, the desert air cooling after another blazing sunset. Inside a modest apartment complex, 36-year-old Girly Hossencofftt moves through her evening routine with the precision of someone who finds comfort in order. Her Bank of America uniform hangs pressed and ready for tomorrow's shift. Every detail matters when your world feels fragile. Girly spreads divorce paperwork across her small dining table, each page another step toward freedom from a marriage that has become a prison. Court filings for separation and protective orders stack neatly beside her. The legal language feels cold, but the protection it promises feels necessary. She has already confided to coworkers her deepest fear. If anything happens to her, it will be him. The phone rings. She lets it go to voicemail, knowing the voice waiting there. Diazian's calls have become predictable charm mixed with threat, promises twisted with control. The answering machine clicks off, leaving silence that feels both empty and full of possibility. At the bank, her colleagues see only Girly's gentle nature and unfailing politeness. They don't know about the lock she's had changed or the route she varies driving home. They don't know she keeps curtains drawn and checks her rearview mirror more than necessary. What they do know is that she's filing for divorce from a man she describes as dangerous. If anything happens, it's him, she tells a trusted coworker during a quiet lunch break. The words hang between them like a prayer and a warning. Local news barely notes another domestic violence petition among the dozens filed weekly. Girly becomes another quiet statistic in a system that moves slowly while fear moves fast. The legal process feels protective on paper, but restraining orders are just words when facing someone who believes rules don't apply to him. Girly folds laundry with mechanical precision, each crease a small victory over chaos. She double-checks her apartment door, tests the chain, listens to the silence that might mean safety or might mean he's just waiting. Outside, Albuquerque settles into another ordinary night, unaware that by next summer, fear will have a date and a clock. A health and spiritual seminar fills a community center on a warm afternoon. Fluorescent lights hum over, folding chairs where seekers gather, hoping to find meaning beyond the mundane. Linda Henning, a successful fashion designer in her mid-40s, sits forward with the intensity of someone hungry for purpose. At the front of the room, Diazian Hossencofftt commands attention with the confidence of someone who has practiced reinvention. He speaks of genetics and cancer research, claiming credentials that shift like smoke. His voice carries authority as he describes centuries of life experience, secret government work, and DNA that transcends human limitations. To the uninitiated, he sounds like a man with answers. To Linda, desperately seeking connection after years of conventional disappointment, he sounds like destiny. Attendees lean in as Diazian weaves tales of alien contact and covert operations. His stories have the polish of frequent telling, each detail delivered with unwavering conviction. He speaks of missions only he can understand, of knowledge only he can share. In a room full of spiritual seekers, he positions himself as the ultimate insider. Linda breaks off her engagement within weeks of meeting Diazian. Friends who question her sudden devotion find themselves shut out as she reshapes her world around his visions. Her successful business, her stable relationships, her grounded skepticism all become obstacles to the greater truth he reveals. She trades her engagement ring for weapons and whispered plans. Albuquerque has always attracted eccentrics. The desert landscape seems to nurture those who see beyond conventional reality. Few neighbors imagine that talk of extraterrestrials and government conspiracies could mask genuine danger. The city's tolerance for the unusual becomes camouflage for the deadly. Weeks turn to rituals, phone calls that stretch past midnight, late drives to remote locations, whispered conversations about missions and enemies. Linda's friends watch helplessly as she disappears into Diazian's manufactured reality. Their concerns are dismissed as jealousy or narrow-mindedness. As Linda watches Diazian's taillights fade into another night, her eyes shine with the certainty of the converted. She has found her purpose, her partner, her cause. She has no idea she has also found her path to prison. Night descends on Diazian's apartment, where scattered notebooks and hand-drawn diagrams cover every surface. Pseudo-scientific charts detail genetic modifications and extraterrestrial hierarchies. Linda studies each page like scripture, absorbing a worldview where she and Diazian are chosen beings with a sacred mission. But every mission needs an enemy, and Diazian has identified theirs. Girly becomes more than an estranged wife seeking divorce. In Diazian's narrative, she transforms into a hostile force blocking their cosmic purpose. He reframes her protective orders as evidence of her interference with otherworldly work. Her gentle nature becomes tactical deception. Her desire for safety becomes an attack on their destiny. Linda carries weapons now, speaking casually of non-human threats and national security concerns. Friends who once knew her as creative and grounded hear her repeat phrases about reptilian enemies and genetic purification. The woman who designed beautiful clothes now designs justifications for violence. Fringe radio shows and late-night television feed a growing appetite for conspiracy theories. In this landscape, Diazian's fantasies find fertile ground. His stories of alien DNA and secret missions tap into cultural currents of suspicion and wonder. What seems absurd to some feels revelatory to others. Summer edges toward September, toward plans that require more than talk. Shopping lists replace philosophical discussions. Duct tape, tarps, and cleaning supplies become tools of transformation. The alien gospel demands action, and Linda has become its most devoted disciple. Witnesses later recall Linda's increasing isolation from her former social circle. She speaks openly of killing as a matter of national security, framing murder as cosmic necessity. The boundaries between fantasy and action dissolve as September approaches. Their shared delusion reaches critical mass. Two minds reinforcing each other's twisted logic, building toward a moment when belief becomes deed. In their manufactured reality, removing Girly isn't murder, it's salvation. A shopping list sits on Diazian's kitchen counter, innocent items that will soon become evidence. Duct tape, tarps, cleaning supplies. The alien gospel has found its first commandment. At 7:58 a.m. on September 9, 1999, the Bank of America branch prepares for another busy morning. The supervisor checks the clock, noting Girly's empty teller station. In 3 years of employment, Girly Hossencofftt has never missed a shift without calling. Her punctuality is absolute, a personal standard that colleagues respect and depend upon. Timesheets and call logs will later document the growing concern as minutes pass without contact. Co-workers dial Girly's home number repeatedly, listening to rings that go unanswered. The manager authorizes a welfare check, something that feels both necessary and somehow final. By 8:30 a.m., concerned voices fill the break room. Girly's teller window remains closed, while customers form longer lines at other stations. Staff members exchange worried glances, remembering her recent fears about her estranged husband. Someone mentions the divorce papers, the protective orders, the quiet admission that she feared for her life. The bank's routine morning dissolves into whispered conferences and sideways glances at the empty chair. Regular customers ask about Girly's absence, their concern genuine and growing. She has built relationships with dozens of people who depend on her gentle efficiency and warm smile. A patrol car rolls into the apartment complex at 9:15 a.m., its presence immediately noticed by neighbors who peer through curtains and gather in doorways. The welfare check feels routine to the officers until they reach Girly's front door. The metallic scent hits them before they see the evidence. Blood has a particular smell that experienced officers recognize immediately. When the apartment manager unlocks the door, the scene inside transforms a welfare check into something much darker. Minutes pass in careful documentation and urgent radio calls. Within hours, what began as a missing person case becomes a homicide investigation. Girly's empty teller window becomes a memorial, and her apartment becomes a crime scene. At 10:12 a.m., detectives secure the scene that will haunt their investigation for years. Blinds hang half-drawn, filtering morning light through a space that tells the story of violence. Blood has soaked into carpet fibers and splattered across walls in patterns that speak of struggle and terror. The metallic scent fills rooms where someone fought for their life. Forensic photographers document every angle, while investigators map the evidence with methodical precision. Luminol reveals blood traces where someone attempted hasty cleanup, but the volume and spatter patterns indicate injuries too severe for survival. White marks suggest panic, someone trying to erase what cannot be undone. Swabs and samples fill evidence bags as the investigation team builds a catalog of violence. Blood volume calculations will later determine that loss of this magnitude means death, even without recovering a body. The apartment becomes a crime scene without a corpse, a homicide investigation built on absence. Neighbors gather behind yellow tape, phones capturing images that will spread through social media before investigators finish processing the scene. Rumors flare across the complex as residents realize that someone they knew, someone quiet and kind, has become the center of something terrible. The search for Girly's body begins immediately, but investigators already understand they're building a different kind of case. Proving murder without remains requires absolute precision in collecting blood evidence, establishing timelines, and documenting every trace of violence. By afternoon, names surface in witness statements and background checks: the estranged husband with his restraining orders and threats, the new girlfriend with her sudden devotion and strange beliefs. The investigation shifts from missing person to homicide, from welfare check to manhunt. Evidence bags seal shut with metallic clicks that seem to echo the finality of what happened here. Yellow tape flutters in desert wind that carries no answers, only questions that will drive investigators through months of painstaking work. Hardware store security cameras capture mundane transactions that become crucial evidence. Timestamps on receipts mark the hours when ordinary items transform into instruments of concealment. Duct tape, tarps, and cleaning supplies, purchases innocent in isolation, sinister in combination. Store clerks remember the couple, their nervous energy and hurried selections. Witnesses place Diazian and Linda together during the crucial window when Girly disappeared, their shopping list reading like preparation for disposal rather than home improvement. Transaction records provide timestamps that align perfectly with the crime timeline. Surveillance stills freeze moments that investigators will examine frame by frame. Linda's face shows determination. Diazian's shows calculation. Their body language suggests shared purpose, two people executing a plan that required specific supplies purchased in specific sequence. The receipts tell a story of premeditation, multiple stores, careful selection of items, cash payments that might have avoided detection if not for the cameras watching every transaction. Defense attorneys will later argue innocent explanations, but the timeline speaks for itself. Talk radio begins picking up the story, initial coverage mocking claims about alien DNA while missing the genuine horror beneath the absurd surface. The tone shifts as details emerge, humor giving way to recognition that real violence has occurred. Media attention brings scrutiny that investigators both need and dread. Evidence collection extends beyond the apartment to trace every movement, every purchase, every moment when planning became action. The mundane becomes meaningful when filtered through the lens of homicide investigation. That night, according to witness sightings, taillights head west toward open desert where evidence can disappear into landscape too vast for complete searching. A trunk closes on secrets that the desert wind will scatter but never fully bury. Dawn breaks cold over U.S. Highway 60 near Magdalena, where search teams line up across terrain that could hide evidence for decades. Grid patterns divide the landscape into manageable sections as investigators begin the methodical work of looking for what someone tried to make disappear forever. Items believed to be Girly's clothing emerge from remote areas where few travelers venture. Each piece requires careful documentation, location, condition, surrounding evidence that might link discoveries to the crime. Search coordinates are mapped with GPS precision, creating a record that will survive courtroom scrutiny. Bagged garments move through chain of custody protocols that transform found objects into legal evidence. Fiber traces on the clothing match materials later linked to Linda's possessions, invisible connections that forensic analysis will reveal. The desert gives up its secrets reluctantly, piece by piece. Local ranchers join the search, their knowledge of wind patterns and seasonal changes helping investigators understand how items might travel across the landscape. Community solidarity grows as residents realize the scope of the crime. Volunteers bring water and determination to work that feels both hopeless and essential. The search covers vast terrain that could swallow evidence without trace. Partial recovery becomes the reality as teams accept that the desert has claimed some secrets permanently. Each discovery feels significant against the backdrop of emptiness that stretches to every horizon. Lab vans transport evidence back to Albuquerque, where specialists will examine every fiber, every trace of DNA, every microscopic clue that might connect victims to perpetrators. The desert search ends with flags marking discovery sites on maps that will guide future investigations. A flag pins another square of desert on the expanding map, each marker representing hours of careful searching and the hope that justice might emerge from landscape designed to hide. Fluorescent lights hum in interview rooms where investigators confront suspects whose reality seems disconnected from evidence. Diazian speaks of secret agencies and reptilian enemies, his stories shifting with each telling while maintaining the confident tone of someone who believes his own lies. Linda claims hybrid identity and describes Girly's alien abduction as if reading from a script only she can see. Recorded statements fill hours of tape with fantasies that investigators must parse for fragments of truth. Transcripts catalog contradictions that stack like evidence, each inconsistency revealing the gap between manufactured reality and actual events. The suspects' delusions become part of the evidence against them. Timelines collapse under questioning as stories change to accommodate inconvenient facts. Purchases, locations, and movements that seemed innocent in planning become impossible to explain when confronted with receipts and witness statements. The mundane details of real life intrude on cosmic narratives. Investigators maintain professional composure while listening to explanations that sound like science fiction. Their job requires focusing on facts that can be proven rather than stories that can be imagined. Each interview reveals more about the suspect's detachment from reality and their willingness to justify violence through delusion. Headlines split between tragedy and spectacle as media coverage struggles to balance genuine loss with absurd claims. Girly's death risks becoming secondary to the entertainment value of her killer's fantasies. Responsible reporting competes with sensationalism for public attention. Weeks pass as the case grows heavier rather than colder. Evidence accumulates while suspects maintain their alternative reality, creating a gulf between what happened and what they claim happened. The investigation becomes an exercise in translating delusion into legal language. A lab technician locks a freezer containing labeled swabs marked apartment and car, physical evidence that will speak louder than any story when the case reaches trial. Rain taps against the police garage roof as forensic teams process Linda Henning's vehicle with the methodical precision that homicide cases demand. Every surface becomes potential evidence, every stain a possible link between suspect and victim. The car holds secrets that no amount of cleaning can completely erase. DNA profile matches confirm Girly's blood in multiple locations throughout the vehicle's interior. The blood pattern suggests transport rather than incidental contact, painting a picture of a body moved from crime scene to disposal site. Fiber lifts reveal traces that will later match materials found in the desert searches. Microscopic analysis builds connections invisible to the naked eye. Individual fibers link the car to duct tape, the tape to Girly's clothing, the clothing to remote locations where evidence was scattered. Each link strengthens a chain that grows harder to break with every test result. Public mood shifts as forensic results leak through official channels and media reports. Horror overcomes initial snickering about alien conspiracies. The reality of blood evidence transforms bizarre stories into genuine tragedy, refocusing attention on the victim rather than her killer's delusions. Defense preparations begin immediately, challenging contamination protocols and chain of custody procedures. Every test will be scrutinized, every procedure questioned. The forensic team knows their work must be perfect to survive courtroom challenges that will attack every possible weakness. The case file moves from suspicion to charges as evidence accumulates beyond reasonable doubt. Blood, fibers, timelines, and witness statements create a mosaic that overwhelms any alternative explanation. What began as welfare check has become unshakable proof of murder. Detectives exchange meaningful looks as lab results confirm what they suspected from the apartment scene. Now they can move forward with arrests, knowing their evidence will speak louder than any fantasy. Humid Charleston morning air carries the tension of manhunt operations as U.S. Marshals brief their teams on Diazian Hossencofftt's capture. Months of investigation have traced him across state lines to South Carolina, where local law enforcement has located their fugitive, living under assumed circumstances that mirror his pattern of deception. The arrest proceeds without incident, Diazian offering no resistance when confronted with federal warrant. His possessions include materials that echo his delusional claims, notebooks filled with pseudo-scientific diagrams, identification documents bearing false credentials, and personal items that suggest someone living entirely within manufactured identity. Extradition procedures begin immediately, paperwork moving through legal channels that will return him to New Mexico to face charges. Transport logs document every step of the process, creating an unbreakable chain of custody that prevents any claims of procedural violation. Every detail matters when building a case this complex. News tickers flash updates across television screens. Husband captured in cross-country manhunt. Media attention intensifies as the story gains national scope, transforming a local tragedy into a case study in delusion and violence. Public interest grows with each revelation. Diazian postures for attention during booking procedures, maintaining his persona even in handcuffs. He threatens to confuse proceedings with continued claims about government connections and extraterrestrial contacts. His performance continues even as evidence mounts against him. Back in New Mexico, a booking camera clicks and freezes his practiced smile for the mugshot that will become evidence. The arrest brings closure to the manhunt phase while opening the next chapter of legal proceedings that will determine his fate. Federal cooperation and state charges align as prosecutors prepare their case. Diazian's capture represents progress, but Linda Henning remains at large, her own arrest imminent as investigators close in on both suspects. Courthouse hallways echo with purposeful footsteps as prosecutors prepare to file charges that will define the case for years. Legal documents stack with the weight of evidence that has accumulated through months of investigation. First-degree murder, kidnapping, and conspiracy charges reflect the severity of crimes that began with shared delusion and ended with death. Indictments detail the evidence trail: blood in Linda's car, fibers linking suspects to crime scene materials, bullet fragments recovered from the apartment, and clothing found along Highway 60 near Magdalena. Affidavits recite witness statements that place both suspects together during crucial timeframes when purchases were made and evidence was disposed. Linda Henning's arrest follows within days of the charges being filed. The fashion designer who once created beauty now faces accusations of participating in brutal murder. Her booking photograph contrasts sharply with professional portraits that show a different person entirely, someone who existed before delusion consumed rational thought. Opinion pages struggle to understand how belief transformed into lethal action. Editorial writers examine the psychology of shared delusion while avoiding sensationalism that might overshadow the victim's memory. Public discourse seeks meaning in tragedy that defies easy explanation. Pretrial maneuvering begins as defense teams challenge evidence collection and seek to suppress statements made during interrogation. Discovery battles rage over witness lists and expert testimony that will shape jury understanding of complex forensic evidence. Every legal strategy aims to control narrative before trial begins. Calendars fill with hearing dates as both sides prepare for litigation that will test the limits of circumstantial evidence. Lab reports require expert interpretation. Witness statements need corroboration, and timelines demand precise documentation that can withstand cross-examination. File boxes thud onto prosecutor desks, their contents representing hundreds of hours of banned CINT investigation distilled into evidence that must prove murder beyond reasonable doubt. The laboratory conference room fills with cold coffee and careful analysis as forensic experts finalize their conclusions about Girly's death. Blood loss calculations indicate fatal injury. Trajectory analysis suggests struggle and violence. Bullet fragments complete a picture of homicide that requires no body to prove death occurred. Blood volume measurements from the apartment scene exceed survivable limits, creating medical certainty about fatal outcome. Spatter patterns reveal the dynamics of violence, while white marks document attempted concealment. The apartment tells the story of someone who died fighting for life. Fiber comparisons link Linda's duct tape roll to materials found with Girly's clothing in desert locations. Metallurgical analysis of bullet fragments traces ammunition types and possible weapons. Each test builds connections that transform circumstantial evidence into compelling proof. The totality of evidence meets legal thresholds for prosecution without recovering remains. Blood, bullets, and fibers create a chain of proof that speaks for a victim who cannot testify on her own behalf. Prosecutors declare themselves trial-ready despite the absence that defines the case. Vigils form outside the bank where Girly worked, co-workers leaving flowers at her empty teller window. Community grief focuses on celebrating her life rather than sensationalizing her death. Memorial gatherings emphasize the person lost rather than the manner of her loss. Defense preparations hint at alternate scenarios that might explain evidence without requiring murder conviction. The absence of Girly's body becomes the foundation for reasonable doubt arguments that will challenge every forensic conclusion. Legal strategy builds around what cannot be proven rather than what can. A pen scratches across a plea agreement as the midpoint moment arrives. Diazian agrees to second-degree murder in exchange for testimony against Linda, fundamentally altering the trajectory of both cases while raising questions about the reliability of a confessed killer's word. The courtroom falls quiet as Diazian enters his plea to second-degree murder, accepting life plus 61 years in exchange for testimony against Linda Henning. His allocution sounds rehearsed, filled with self-serving justifications that blame others while minimizing his own role. The plea colloquy becomes part of the record that will define both cases. Sentencing proceedings move quickly once guilt is established. The judge imposes the agreed-upon penalty while noting the defendant's lack of genuine remorse. Diazian's performance continues even in defeat, his statements revealing someone who views the proceedings as another stage for his delusions. His first post-plea interview with prosecutors reveals the weakness in their new witness. Stories shift with each telling, contradictions bloom like weeds, and reliability becomes the central question. The man who lies about his identity and history proves equally unreliable about his crimes. Talk shows debate the wisdom of using a convicted murderer as the star witness in another murder trial. Legal experts question whether testimony from someone with such documented delusional tendencies can support conviction. Public opinion divides between pragmatic prosecution and principled evidence standards. Prosecutors must now insulate Linda's case from Diazian's shifting narratives while using his cooperation to fill gaps in their timeline. The challenge becomes extracting useful truth from someone whose relationship with reality remains tenuous. Corroboration becomes essential for every claim. Trial preparation intensifies as Linda's defense team prepares to attack their client's co-defendant as the primary perpetrator and ultimate manipulator. Diazian's plea provides ammunition for arguments about who controlled whom in their shared delusion. Blame becomes a legal strategy. Trial notices go out with late-year scheduling that allows both sides to prepare for proceedings that will test New Mexico's death penalty laws. Linda stares forward with an expression that reveals nothing about her thoughts as the most important trial of her life approaches. Jury selection morning arrives with fluorescent lighting that seems to hum with tension as prospective jurors fill the courtroom for the most significant death penalty case in recent New Mexico history. The voir dire process must identify 12 citizens capable of evaluating evidence without being overwhelmed by the bizarre circumstances surrounding the crime. Questionnaires probe attitudes toward conspiracy theories, no-body homicide cases, and capital punishment. Attorneys seek jurors who can separate facts from speculation while remaining open to evidence that challenges conventional understanding. The selection process becomes an exercise in finding balance between skepticism and fairness. Several potential jurors admit following media coverage of the alien DNA angle, but affirm their ability to focus on courtroom evidence rather than newspaper headlines. The judge questions each individual about their exposure to pretrial publicity and their capacity to render verdicts based solely on admissible proof. Defense challenges highlight concerns about prejudicial publicity and community bias against their client. The judge denies motions for venue change while ordering careful jury instructions about separating evidence from speculation. Legal safeguards attempt to ensure fair proceedings despite sensational circumstances. Outside the courthouse, activists hold signs honoring Girly's memory while protesters debate the appropriateness of seeking death penalty for a first-time offender influenced by psychological manipulation. Public demonstrations reflect divided opinions about justice and mercy in cases involving mental health concerns. By afternoon, 12 jurors and alternates take their oath with the weight of potential life and death decisions ahead. The sworn panel represents the community's conscience in proceedings that will test the limits of justice and the boundaries of reasonable doubt. The oath settles like a weight in the courtroom, binding citizens to their constitutional duty while preparing them for evidence that will challenge their understanding of human nature and criminal responsibility. Trial day one arrives with a packed gallery as prosecutor and defense attorney present, competing narratives about shared delusion and individual responsibility. Opening statements frame evidence that jurors will evaluate over coming weeks, each side attempting to control interpretation before witnesses take the stand. The prosecutor outlines motive through folie à dos, shared psychotic disorder, where two people reinforce each other's delusions until fantasy becomes deadly action. Forensic evidence follows. Girly's blood in Linda's car, duct tape fibers matching Linda's possessions, bullet fragments from the apartment, and desert clothing recovery tied to both defendants' movements along Highway 60. Defense strategy focuses on manipulation by Diazian, portraying Linda as a vulnerable woman captured by a master manipulator's web of lies. Without Girly's body, they argue, no murder can be proven beyond reasonable doubt. Intent becomes the battlefield where guilt or innocence will be determined. The prosecution previews witnesses who heard Linda speak openly of killing Girly as a matter of national security, transforming abstract delusion into concrete threat. These statements, made to multiple independent witnesses, demonstrate consciousness of guilt and premeditation that defeats any manipulation defense. Media dubs the proceedings logic versus madness as competing narratives struggle for juror acceptance. The trial becomes a test of whether shared delusion can excuse individual action or whether legal responsibility survives psychological manipulation. Public interest focuses on precedential implications. Evidence presentations will require jurors to separate verified facts from fantastic claims while evaluating whether Linda acted with criminal intent or psychological compulsion. The burden of proof demands certainty in cases where certainty seems impossible to achieve. Courtroom lights dim as prosecutors prepare to present crime scene photographs that will force jurors to confront the reality of violence that occurred in Girly's apartment. The next phase begins with rooms that speak through blood and evidence. Courtroom lights lower as crime scene photographs fill projection screens with images that transform abstract charges into visceral reality. Blood-soaked carpet and spatter patterns document violence that speaks louder than any witness testimony. The apartment becomes a classroom where forensic experts teach jurors to read evidence written in blood. Crime scene technicians testify with clinical precision about blood volume analysis and spatter interpretation. Their methodology transforms chaos into science, explaining how physics and biology combine to reveal the dynamics of Girly's final moments. Luminol images show attempts at cleanup that only highlight the extent of violence. Blood volume calculations prove fatal injury beyond medical doubt, establishing death without requiring a body. White patterns indicate someone tried to clean evidence, while spatter analysis reveals the original violence that no amount of cleaning could completely erase. The apartment holds secrets that science can unlock. Patterns indicate attempts to roll or drag a body, suggesting movement from crime scene to transportation. Chain of custody documentation proves evidence integrity, while expert testimony explains how laboratory analysis transforms bloodstains into legal proof. Every sample tells part of Girly's story. Defense objections focus on prejudicial impact of graphic images, arguing that photographs inflame passion rather than inform judgment. The judge limits but admits evidence that probative value outweighs emotional impact. Legal standards balance truth with fairness in proceedings designed to seek justice. Viewers watching court coverage turn away during the most graphic presentations, the reality of violence overwhelming their curiosity about the bizarre circumstances. The crime scene evidence grounds sensational stories in the tragedy of one woman's death. A swab kit rests on the witness ledge as court recesses, physical reminder that science continues speaking for victims who cannot speak for themselves. Mid-trial morning brings forensic analysis to center stage, as laboratory experts present DNA evidence that links Linda's vehicle directly to Girly's death. Scientific testimony transforms microscopic traces into overwhelming proof of transportation from crime scene to disposal site. Forensic analysts confirm Girly's blood in Linda's car through DNA profiles that eliminate any possibility of mistaken identity. Comparison tables show genetic markers that match perfectly, while blood pattern analysis in the trunk area contradicts any claims of accidental transfer. The evidence speaks with scientific certainty. Duct tape fiber analysis reveals microscopic matches between rolls linked to Linda's possessions and materials found with Girly's clothing in desert locations. Micrographs displayed on courtroom screens show fiber comparisons that connect crime scene to disposal site through invisible threads that survived wind and weather. Defense cross-examination challenges laboratory procedures and chain of custody protocols, seeking any weakness that might create reasonable doubt. Questions about contamination possibilities and secondary transfer theories attempt to undermine scientific conclusions that appear unshakable. Headlines declare science cuts through the UFO talk as media coverage emphasizes forensic evidence over sensational claims. Public attention shifts from bizarre conspiracy theories to methodical proof that builds conviction through accumulated detail rather than dramatic revelation. The afternoon session promises desert testimony that will place both defendants along Highway 60 during the crucial time frame when evidence was scattered across landscape designed to hide secrets. Maps covered with exhibit pins await presentation to jurors. Blood pattern evidence demonstrates Linda's vehicle served as transportation between crime scene and body disposal, creating an unbreakable link in the chain of proof that connects her directly to Girly's death. Afternoon testimony brings desert search supervisors to the witness stand, their methodical documentation transforming vast landscape into precise evidence locations. GPS coordinates and field notes create a record that places Linda and Diazian's movements along Highway 60 at times when Girly's clothing was scattered across remote terrain. Clothing recovery near Magdalena aligns perfectly with witness sightings and purchase timelines that demonstrate premeditation and disposal planning. Each piece of evidence emerges from landscape that could hide secrets for decades, testament to thorough searching and community cooperation that refused to let Girly disappear completely. Search logs document grid patterns and recovery protocols that ensure every discovery meets legal standards for courtroom presentation. Item photographs show clothing conditions and surrounding evidence that connect desert findings to apartment crime scene through scientific analysis and timeline reconstruction. Dust and plant residues on recovered clothing match specific geological signatures from pull-offs used by both defendants during their disposal journey. Environmental evidence creates location links that place suspects at disposal sites during timeframes when evidence was scattered across the desert. Community members sit in the gallery as ranchers who join search efforts nod along with testimony about terrain and weather patterns. Local knowledge helped guide recovery efforts, while volunteer determination ensured comprehensive coverage of areas where evidence might be found. Defense challenges focus on certainty without remains, pushing witnesses about limitations of circumstantial evidence and possibilities of alternative explanations. Search supervisors maintain steady testimony about methodical procedures and scientific analysis that support their conclusion. Sand trickles from an evidence bag as testimony concludes, physical reminder of the desert landscape that yielded its secrets to persistent investigation and refused to keep Girly's story buried forever. Morning brings lay witnesses who transform Linda's abstract delusions into concrete threats through testimony about statements made in the months before Girly's death. Friends and associates recall conversations where Linda spoke openly of killing as necessary for national security, her words revealing consciousness of guilt and premeditation. Two independent witnesses, unknown to each other, recall nearly identical phrasing from Linda about eliminating threats to her and Diazian's mission. Their corroborating testimony demonstrates consistent intent over time, rather than momentary impulse or psychological break. The repetition suggests planning rather than passion. Prior statements documented through notes and corroborating witnesses establish Linda's state of mind before the crime occurred. Defense suggestions of embellishment crumble under cross-examination that reveals consistent timelines and independent corroboration from multiple sources. Social media feeds light up with commentary about cult logic and shared psychosis as testimony reveals how two people convinced themselves that murder served a greater purpose. Public fascination with the psychological dynamics competes with respect for Girly's memory and her family's grief. After lunch, the courtroom prepares for Diazian's testimony under subpoena, his reliability already compromised by contradictory statements and plea agreement motivations. His presence on the witness stand represents both prosecution necessity and strategic risk in building their case against Linda. A courtroom door opens as footsteps slow, bringing the confessed killer face-to-face with jurors who must evaluate his credibility while remembering his admitted role in the victim's death. Afternoon session brings Diazian to the witness stand under subpoena, his testimony representing both prosecution tool and potential liability. He delivers self-serving narratives that toggle between grandiose claims and convenient vagueness, his answers shaped more by self-interest than truth-seeking. Prior inconsistent statements become impeachment ammunition as prosecutors confront their own witness with contradictions that undermine his credibility. His plea agreement and life sentence create obvious motivations for cooperation that defense attorneys will exploit mercilessly during cross-examination. Under cross-examination by the prosecutor, Diazian contradicts an earlier timeline about crucial events, his unreliability becoming apparent even to those who called him as witness. His theatrical personality emerges as he attempts to control testimony through dramatic gestures and conspiratorial hints. Jury instructions about credibility and witness motivation become essential as the judge explains how to evaluate testimony from someone with clear incentives to lie. The legal system acknowledges that truth sometimes requires imperfect messengers while maintaining standards for reliability. Commentators describe Diazian as a circus act while advising viewers to focus on scientific evidence rather than theatrical performance. Media coverage emphasizes the danger of anchoring verdicts on unreliable testimony when solid forensic proof exists independently. The witness exits, with his practiced smirk intact, leaving behind testimony that serves prosecution goals while highlighting the challenges of building cases around confessed killers whose relationship with truth remains questionable. His performance becomes evidence of his character rather than his credibility. Closing arguments await as both sides prepare to synthesize weeks of evidence into compelling narratives that will guide jury deliberations toward verdicts that could determine Linda's life or death. Morning arrives with a packed courtroom as attorneys prepare to crystallize weeks of evidence into competing stories about guilt, innocence, and the nature of criminal responsibility. Opening statements promised evidence, and now closing arguments must deliver conclusions that guide jury deliberations. The prosecutor walks jurors through the chain of evidence: apartment blood that proves death, car DNA that proves transportation, duct tape fibers that prove connection, bullet fragments that prove violence, desert clothing that proves disposal, and witness threats that prove premeditation. Each link strengthens a chain with no missing connections. Exhibit boards revisit key evidence while timelines align purchases with movements and disposal with discovery. The prosecution emphasizes the clean arc from planning to execution to concealment, demonstrating consciousness of guilt and criminal intent that defeats any manipulation defense. Defense arguments focus on Linda's vulnerability to Diazian's psychological manipulation, portraying her as a victim rather than perpetrator. Without Girly's body, they argue, prosecutors cannot prove murder beyond reasonable doubt. Intent becomes the final battlefield where reasonable doubt might survive overwhelming evidence. Outside the courthouse, a quiet vigil maintains focus on Girly's memory through photographs and candles that honor her life, rather than sensationalizing her death. Community grief provides context for legal proceedings that sometimes lose sight of human cost in technical debates. The competing narratives present jurors with a choice between overwhelming forensic evidence and lingering questions about psychological manipulation. Reasonable doubt battles against scientific certainty in deliberations that will determine justice for all involved. The jury files out with binders full of evidence and notes from weeks of testimony, their decision carrying the weight of Linda's potential death sentence and Girly's demand for justice. Afternoon tension fills the courtroom as jurors return after deliberations that weighed overwhelming evidence against defense claims of manipulation and reasonable doubt. The verdict forms in the foreperson's hands represent months of investigation and weeks of testimony distilled into final judgment. Guilty verdicts ring through the courtroom: first-degree murder, kidnapping, conspiracy to commit murder, evidence tampering, and accessory counts. Each charge affirmed by 12 citizens who found prosecution evidence compelling beyond reasonable doubt, despite the absence of Girly's body. Polling of individual jurors confirms unanimous agreement on all counts, their certainty based on forensic evidence that spoke louder than any alternative explanation. Post-trial interviews reveal that car blood evidence and duct tape fiber matches sealed their decision about Linda's guilt. Gasps and tears fill the gallery as Girly supporters absorb verdicts that affirm her death, while friends of Linda process the reality of potential death penalty. Headlines transform from speculation to solemn recognition that justice has spoken through citizen deliberation. The penalty phase looms as defense attorneys prepare arguments against death penalty for a first-time offender influenced by psychological manipulation. Prosecution readies evidence about aggravating factors that support ultimate punishment for premeditated murder with special circumstances. Victim impact statements prepare to give voice to Girly's family in Malaysia, their grief compounded by distance and the absence of remains for proper burial. Their loss transcends legal categories while demanding recognition through judicial proceedings. Linda sits motionless as verdicts are read, her expression revealing nothing about inner thoughts as the most serious consequences await determination. Sentencing proceedings will decide whether she lives or dies for her role in Girly's death. Sentencing day arrives under gray skies that seem to match the somber mood of proceedings that will determine Linda's ultimate fate. The judge has weighed evidence, arguments, and impact statements in reaching a decision that balances justice with mercy in one of New Mexico's most significant death penalty cases. The judge calls Linda intelligent but dangerously influenced by delusion while imposing a sentence of 73 years to life, narrowly avoiding the death penalty through consideration of her susceptibility to manipulation. The punishment acknowledges both the severity of her crimes and the psychological factors that contributed to her actions. Sentencing orders document the court's reasoning, while victim impact statements give voice to Girly's family overseas, their grief complicated by distance and the absence of remains for cultural burial practices. A letter from Malaysia speaks to loss that transcends legal proceedings. The reading of overseas correspondence brings tears to spectators who realize that justice for Girly extends far beyond New Mexico courtrooms to family members who may never find complete closure. Cultural considerations add layers to grief that legal verdicts cannot fully address. Editorial pages weigh accountability against mental health considerations in cases where shared delusion becomes deadly action. Public discourse struggles with questions about criminal responsibility when psychological manipulation influences decision-making. No remains have been recovered, despite extensive searches, leaving Girly's family without the closure that burial might provide. The court's findings formally recognize her death while acknowledging the incompleteness that marks this case permanently. A candle appears on courthouse steps as evening falls, community tribute to a victim whose memory survives despite the absence of her physical remains. Quiet evening settles over a newsroom studio where anchors prepare final coverage of a case that challenged understanding of shared delusion and criminal responsibility. Years have passed since verdicts were rendered, but the story continues through appeals, interviews, and ongoing consequences for those involved. Diazian remains incarcerated with parole eligibility extending far beyond natural life expectancy, his claims about intelligence connections and extraterrestrial contacts continuing through contradictory interviews that reveal unchanged delusions. His story shifts with each telling while maintaining themes that defined his original defense. Corrections records document Linda's adjustment to life imprisonment, while her appeals work through judicial systems that review death penalty cases with special scrutiny. Her sentence reflects society's struggle to balance accountability with recognition of psychological manipulation and shared psychotic episodes. Investigators and prosecutors label the case a classic example of folie à deux, shared psychosis, where two people reinforce each other's delusions until fantasy becomes deadly reality. The psychological dynamics offer lessons about charismatic manipulation and vulnerable personalities seeking meaning through dangerous beliefs. Community remembrance continues through annual vigils that honor Girly's memory while using her story to raise awareness about domestic violence and the warning signs of escalating abuse. Her death becomes education that might prevent future tragedies through increased recognition of danger signals. The case endures as a cautionary tale about charisma weaponized against innocent victims, obsession disguised as spiritual mission, and the deadly potential of shared delusion when reality testing fails completely. Academic studies examine the psychological mechanisms that transform belief into murder. Final images return to where the story began, a quiet apartment where uniforms were once folded with care, now marked by flowers that community members leave in remembrance of a gentle woman whose only crime was seeking safety and dignity.